Last night I went to the theater and watched Star Trek Beyond, which seems to be the Star Trek movie that nobody involved with had any interest in making. Went through two or three directors and a couple of writing teams, and various actors had signed three-movie contracts at the start, and what few comments were coming out from them was that most of them didn't seem to be expressing much interest in staying on beyond the third movie. So it didn't seem like there was a lot of interest in this, a lot of people clamoring to get onto the project. And then the first trailer came out and was savaged by just about everyone because it looked like a mindless action movie with no plot or characters whatsoever. The fact that Simon Pegg was involved was pretty much the ray of hope that I was holding out for. You know, he writes some good movies in the past, and I was hoping he'd do a good job with this one. The trailer having the song "Sabotage" as the main soundtrack, I had thought that that would actually be pretty clever, a strong defense for the music choice of what happened to the Enterprise, and the trailer was a result of sabotage, which it turns out it wasn't, but the payoff for the music was still pretty nicely done. Before we get into the information on the movie and reviewing that, there's something else I think needs to be addressed first a little bit. Star Trek has reinvented itself over the years several times, as any show or property that's existed for 50 years kind of has to do. Perhaps it hasn't reinvented itself as dramatically as Doctor Who has, but there have been some very disparate and distinct approaches to Star Trek over the decades, which is why the ongoing complaints that the reboot has not been faithful to Star Trek, that they're not, you know, the reboot movies aren't true to the show, have never quite made sense to me. There's a few reasons for this. One is that the nature of movies have changed over time. The approach, you know, the dynamic. You only have to watch a little bit of a movie, a couple of seconds, to get a general feel for what era it was made in. And what was innovative and cutting edge at one time will look extremely dated after a while. Movies are now very heavy on action and spectacle and eye candy. Even more cerebral, you know, thought-provoking films. Inception springs immediately to mind. Have big explosive fight scenes and huge CGI cities, you know, floating in on themselves or crumbling away or whatever. You know, the fact that the reboot Star Trek movies are basically action movies is a sign of the times, progress for better or for worse. Second, what Star Trek had been doing before the reboot, what they had long been, simply wasn't working anymore. Between the movie Nemesis and the TV series Enterprise, Star Trek was completely dead in the water. I mean, people may protest that, but the well was dry, and people really didn't care anymore. Star Trek had to adapt to the times or be forgotten, and it worked. The first Abrams movie blew away all of Trek's box office records. Not adjusting the numbers for inflation, but domestically, the top three grossing Star Trek movies were The Voyage Home, which was the only one to make over $100 million domestically, and then First Contact, and then, believe it or not, the motion picture. The three movies combined grossed about $284 million. The reboot made $257 million by itself, which was a far cry from the previous movie, Nemesis, which only pulled in $43 million domestically on a $60 million budget. Nemesis was a flop in pretty much every sense of the word. And third, and this is the one that really makes the not faithful to Star Trek argument so ridiculous, even Star Trek hasn't been faithful to Star Trek, and not just because of changing standards in TV and movies. The best example of this? The original series was about exploring strange new worlds. The show was canceled in 1970, and since then, the TV show that's been most faithful to that concept actually was Stargate SG-1. The Next Generation started out with the concept, but dropped it fairly early on. They stopped visiting planets that were less technologically advanced or fighting with rifles or swords. They didn't let people on planets know that, hey, there's an entire galactic civilization out there that you're not part of yet. And I think it was the third season they did an episode called Who Watches the Watchers, where Starfleet was observing a culture without the people on the planet knowing, and something went wrong and their observation was discovered, which is portrayed as a hugely detrimental and even catastrophically damaging thing for these people, when they were doing it as a matter of course just 2 seasons earlier. A couple of seasons later, there was an episode called First Contact, not to be confused with the movie with the same name, where it was explicitly stated that Starfleet doesn't contact civilizations until they're about to step into the galactic stage on their own and visit other worlds and find out what's out there. In other words, the Next Generation mostly rejected what is explicitly stated in the opening narration of its own show, and they completely changed the fundamental nature of what Starfleet is and does midstream, and no one even noticed. Star Trek over the years has done purely episodic TV driven by the prime time directive, which is leave things exactly as you found them. They've done serialized storylines that developed over years. They've done series based on diplomacy and peaceful interactions, and they've done series with galactic wars. They've done Lost in Space, and they did it at least as badly as Lost in Space did it. And they've done series solely to wring the last few dollars out of the cash cow's corpse. And with Nemesis, they even did live-action fan fiction. So they've been all over the map. And to say that the new movies aren't Star Trek because they're not the same as what they were doing before, that makes no sense to me. They've done lots of different things before, and some of them worked and some of them didn't, and it was time to move on. Now, all that said, Star Trek Beyond felt more like classic Star Trek than the previous 2 movies did, which is especially ironic when you consider that Into Darkness basically plagiarized large chunks of classic Star Trek all on its own. After a setup reboot movie and then Star Trek II, we finally get something that's largely original and operating on its own rather than trying to stand next to what came before and openly inviting direct comparison, which, the change is refreshing and appreciated because the direct comparison usually is not going to work well on, as far as the other new show goes. So Star Trek Beyond wasn't perfect, things never are, and despite some glaring weaknesses, there's a lot to like here. First and foremost, I really liked Sofia Boutella's Jayla. I really liked her. What we learned of her past made her sympathetic but not a victim, or at least not any more of a victim than anyone else on the planet. She was capable and competent and in control of what she was doing. She was never a damsel in distress whose function was to be rescued by a man. The fact that she'd been working on the USS Franklin for some years made the somewhat contrived and extremely convenient presence of a hidden ship a bit more palatable than them stumbling on the ship and it was abandoned that long and getting it running in a couple of hours. And best of all, the fact that she was a woman had no bearing on anything whatsoever. No one commented on it as if being capable and competent and in control are noteworthy characteristics when demonstrated by a woman. Nobody flirted with her or made inappropriate comments. There was no attempt to play it for a cheap laugh for the audience. She didn't strip down and change outfits while Kirk gawked at her. They could have cast a male in this role and not changed a single thing except for the pronouns and the dialogue. And that is wonderful and something that probably wouldn't have happened a few years back. Most movies can't seem to manage that now. And they didn't go overboard with it and make her a stereotypical hyper-masculine ass-kicking machine, basically making a woman appear powerful by making her stereotypically male in every way possible. She can fight, but she uses technology to give herself an edge, and she doesn't go through swarms of opponents without breaking a sweat like she's Jason freaking Bourne. She's, well, I'm not sure human is necessarily the right term here, but you know what I mean. She's relatable. If you were faced with her circumstances, you could reasonably see yourself taking similar actions. That's good storytelling and it's good character building. In comparison, Idris Elba does okay with what he's given to work with as Krall. One thing that I've learned about constructing stories, both from observation and from some writing, is that creating a good villain is hard. Generic bad guys are easy, but to make a truly effective villain, the audience has to be able to sympathize or relate with them in some way. If you can relate to the villain, even if you can hear his motivations and say to yourself, that makes some sense, you don't have to agree with it to be able to empathize with them. And if you can empathize with them, then then the villain is a lot more powerful and a lot more sympathetic. That is really where I think the strength of the movie The Fugitive came from, with Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones. It's easy to feel bad for Dr. Richard Kimball, who's been accused of a murder he didn't commit. But the key to that movie was they took Tommy Lee Jones' character, Deputy Gerard, trying to track down an innocent man and bring him back to prison where he's going to be executed, and they made you like him too. So, not that Gerard is necessarily the villain in the movie, but you have to be able to relate to and like the people who are working against the protagonist. That really helps with the movie. Star Trek has tried to give some depth to the bad guys, but ideally, the ideal bad guy isn't really a bad guy at all. Just somebody with a different goal and different motivation. Star Trek has a not great track record on this. They've tried to give some depth, but mostly the bad guys have been fairly generic and interchangeable, and their story arc ends not with enlightenment or disarmament, but with death, typically by explosion. I mean, other than the motion picture and the Voyage Home, which basically had probes threatening to destroy the Earth until Kirk and company came along and gave them something better to do, the villains in the other movies traditionally have died by explosion. Star Trek II, Khan got blown up. Star Trek III, crew got incinerated on a planet, which blew up. Star Trek V, Sybok wasn't really a bad guy, but he got blown up. The godlike creature they found at the center of the galaxy, that was more of a villain, and that got blown up too. Star Trek VI, General Chang, blown up. Star Trek Generations, Soren, blown up. First Contact, the Borg Queen, disintegrated. Star Trek Insurrection, I don't even remember the character's name, it's such a lousy movie. F. Murray Abraham got blown up. And if you've seen the Plinkett review, he does a great job of explaining why that's especially appalling and bad writing in that particular case. Then came Nemesis. Shinzon got impaled and then blown up. We did the reboot, and along comes Nero, who gets blown up, and finally Star Trek II with Khan, who finally doesn't get blown up. He gets put back in suspended animation. So 12 films, 10 villains, 9 deaths, 8 by explosion. So there's a pretty solid track record here of not doing great things with the bad guys or the antagonists in the film. So now we've got Krall, and because we aren't given any reason to understand why he's doing the terrible things we see him do, we don't care about him. He destroys passing ships, he tortures and kills. He's an unrepentant monster. He's nothing more than your generic bad guy. He's not a person, he's just a problem to be overcome. Until the end, when his motivations are explained. Up until then, he mostly just makes ominous statements and looms menacingly over people, and he does it very well, but they keep the character mysterious, and as a result, he comes off very much as a cipher, generic movie bad guy whose entire motivation for being evil is that he's the bad guy, and that's it. There turns out to be more to it than that, but by that point, it's a little hard to care, because our attention is, at least my attention, was focused more on the weakest part of the entire movie, which is the Doomsday MacGuffin weapon, which I still do not understand at all. So there's this super powerful handheld weapon that was separated many years ago instead of simply being destroyed, and one of the pieces ended up in the hands of a race that gave it to Kirk to present as a peace offering to another species, which Krall found out about because he has completely compromised Federation cybersecurity. So he sends someone to lure the Enterprise in, and I guess hopes that the piece of the weapon isn't left behind on the starbase, which has a lot more storage space, or destroyed in his attack on the Enterprise. And he eventually gets the piece and gives it a test run, which I honestly have no idea what this was supposed to be. It looked kind of like the swarm he already had, but smaller, and it clearly killed people without a trace, but I don't have any idea why he wanted this particular weapon, or why it was better than any other more conveniently available weapon, or anything about it, really. It was used twice in the film, and I still don't get what it does, or why it exists, or why it was so valuable to him. Why did he need this weapon? Why did he need any weapon when he already had full access to everything in the Federation, even Kirk's personal logs? There's an explanation given for why he goes after the space station, but that's pure speculation. I don't understand why Krall needed this weapon. I don't understand what the mysterious Nebula Step 2 was between Step 1, Attack the Federation, and Step 3, Profit. We're not told any of this. It was just a big bad doomsday MacGuffin, the details of which are of little matter and even less consequence, which is not good storytelling. Now, having gone through that, you may think, from what I'm saying, that I hated this movie, but I didn't. I really didn't. I like this movie. Characters came to the forefront in a way they really haven't before in the reboot, especially between Spock and McCoy. I mean, since the reboot, we've seen them poking at each other and generally being sort of hostile in the way that they've always demonstrated. But in this movie, we finally see the respect that underlies that, the respect they have for each other, and it's put in the forefront for probably the first time since the original cast last go around in '91 with the Undiscovered Country. I mean, it was good to see the substance instead of just the style. I mean, yeah, sure, they snipe at each other a bit, but there's no heat behind it, and they discuss things of import, they're open with each other, they work together. In fact, the entire crew works together. For the first time, we see the Enterprise crew all on the same page. There's no Spock punching Kirk's lights out and strangling him on the bridge. There's no Scotty refusing orders and Kirk kicking him off the ship. There's no confrontations where they question each other's motivations and goals. They work as a team. Even separated in this movie as they are, they all continue to work toward the same goal and hold out hope that the others are survived and are doing the same thing, as opposed to previous films where very carefully selected problems crop up that different crew members are ideally suited to so that they each get their own moment to shine in the script. At times in this film, they debate different ways to go about what they need to do, but it's reasoned discussion, not angry, emotional arguments with each other. In short, this crew finally trusts each other and they act like it. And it's about time. I mean, the interpersonal conflict made some sense previously, but at this point, they've been together for 3 years of a 5-year mission, and however long between the first 2 movies before that, I mean, they've been together a long time here, and if they don't trust each other yet, they never will. So this was a good thing to see. This was progress that had to happen. Now, because this crew was put into essentially a hopeless situation with no ship, no backup, no help on the way, most of the crew captured in enemy territory, outnumbered and outgunned, not one person loses hope. Now, this is a sort of optimism that classic Trek was largely renowned for, and it's something we haven't seen a lot of from Star Trek in quite a while. And Star Trek, at its best, is not necessarily about the plot lines. People don't look back at Star Trek with great fondness because of episodes where they encountered Romulans in a space-age submarine versus destroyer counterpart, or because they have evil goateed counterparts in an alternate universe, or because they fought a giant space amoeba. The plot lines over the years have ranged from solid to silly, but Star Trek's strength has always been in the characters. So even though the plotline in this film is kind of flimsy and ambiguous in places, the movie plays very much to Star Trek's strength, and it benefits strongly from that. Now, just a couple other random thoughts on this. Given the nebula and how insanely difficult it is to safely traverse it, I'm a bit confused about how so damn many ships got close enough to the planet to be attacked. This is the classic, we need a way to put the ship out of contact with any possibility of assistance, let's throw them into a random nebula approach that you're not supposed to give a lot of thought to. I mean, seriously, in the film, look at that nebula. You don't accidentally end up in the center of that thing. Space is infinite. If that's in your way, you go around it. In that same vein, many action sequences don't make much sense when you think about them. During the battle, it doesn't make much sense that the impulse engines can't draw from power source B until the saucer section is separated, even though power source A clearly doesn't exist anymore. Then again, it didn't make a lot of sense in the last movie that the thrusters didn't work if the warp engines were offline. They clearly got that issue resolved, as demonstrated in what has to be the film's goofiest action sequence. But still, they always say infrastructure isn't sexy, but someone really needs to work on this ship's power distribution network because it seems to function more on the basis of plot contrivance than actual logic. Go figure, right? Speaking of plot contrivance rather than actual logic, and going back to my earlier point about spectacle, how about that Starbase Yorktown? Now that is a spectacle. It's huge and grand and sprawling and beautiful and just a joy to behold, and it doesn't make a lick of sense. I mean, completely arbitrary and sometimes spiraling gravity with skyscrapers stretching up toward each other at odd angles and from different directions, and being mostly open air that has to be acquired and placed inside the station and heated but not used for anything. And the station is mostly wasted space. But under the arteries of the city are tunnels that starships fly through, and they can come up under the reflecting pools that are held in place without anything solid above or apparently below them. It works for the film, and it allows Kirk and Carl to engage in some live-action Super Mario Galaxy, but it would be hard to come up with a more inefficient or impractical design, even if you tried. And this station also apparently has no security or transporters or shuttlecraft, as only Kirk is able to get to Carl to stop him, despite the station being informed of what's happening and where it's happening, and being able to see them through the glass walls and watching them float around in the crazy gravity for a while. I guess it's a good thing the main characters were there, right? But again, this movie is about the characters. Kirk questioning what the hell he's doing with his life until tragedy strikes, at which point he falls into the role of command the way he's born to. Spock weighing his career against the obligations to what little remains of the Vulcan people, and learning that his heart is still with Starfleet and he's better with his shipmates than without them, and so on. And that's why this movie works. It's not about stumbling into a random problem and then simply resolving it. It's about how the crew faces these problems, what they learn about themselves and about each other from them. The movie puts a lot of Star Trek's strengths and weaknesses on display simultaneously, but it's a triumph overall, and it's got a lot more heart and substance than most action movies you have to choose from these days. It's no Wrath of Khan, and it's no Undiscovered Country, but a case can be made that this is the best of the 3 reboot films, and it shows that Star Trek doesn't need to be tethered to the original series to succeed, and that can only be considered a good thing for the future of Star Trek.